Imagine being arrested for a crime you barely understand, subjected to weeks of brutal torture, and then dragged into a courtroom where the verdict is all but decided even before you speak. Now, picture fighting for justice in a system designed to break you, only to find yourself facing off against the very government that ruined your life. This is the harrowing yet darkly absurd tale of Wachira, a man who dared to demand justice from a regime that specialized in silencing dissent. Dive into a story where the stakes are as high as the absurdity, and discover the dark comedy woven into the fabric of one man's struggle against tyranny. The air is thick with paranoia, and the government is the equivalent of that overbearing neighbor, watching your every move, only with a lot more power and a penchant for torture. Meet Wachira, our reluctant hero, who found himself an unwilling guest at the dungeons of the infamous Nyayo house. It all started when Wachira was arrested for taking an illegal oath and failing to prevent a felony. Now in most places, an oath is a solemn promise, but in Kenya's Nyayo era, it was a fast track to a very unpleasant stay in a government facility. And so, Wachira was whisked away to Nyayo House, which, if TripAdvisor had existed back then, would have boasted 0 stars, with reviews warning of the dreadful service and the lack of basic amenities, like food, water, and human rights. Upon arrival, Wachira was swiftly introduced to the dismal hospitality standards. The dress code? Non-existent. Food and drink? On a strictly need-to-survive basis, which meant none. Sleep? Only if you could manage it while being interrogated by special branch officers, which meant almost no sleep. His routine at these torture dungeons was simple. Endure endless hours of naked interrogation, while the officers employed a variety of motivational tools, including but not limited to slaps, kicks, assault with broken furniture, and hose-pipe whips. The decor? Minimalist, with waterlogged cells for that extra touch of rustic discomfort. The threats of death were the cherry on top of this hellish cupcake. If you thought your day was rough, imagine dealing with these goons for an astounding 16 days. Eventually, Wachira's time at Nyayo House ended, but not before he was hauled into court on December 17, 1986. The charges: taking an illegal oath, the details of which were as vague as a politician's promise, and failing to prevent an equally vague felony. Given his extended stay in the basement of doom, the courtroom scene was straight out of a Kafka novel, i.e., the stuff of nightmares. Thanks to the healthy dose of threats received while at Nyayo House, the government had made it clear that once taken to court, Wachira only had one plea to take: accept his guilt no matter what charges were thrown his way. Clearly worn down by his VIP treatment thus far, he pleaded guilty, essentially sealing his fate. He did so, not because he was guilty, but because the officers who had so graciously hosted him were also his courtroom audience. Imagine trying to defend yourself while the people who tortured you are sitting in the front row, glaring at you like you're a contestant on the world's cruelest game show. The court took his guilty plea at face value and gave him a 3-year prison sentence. The legal system's efficiency was truly something to behold. Swift, brutal, and utterly indifferent to minor details like the Constitution and illegal detention. The trial magistrate, perhaps eager to get on with lunch, didn't bother to inquire about the 16 days of pre-trial preparation Wachira had endured. Following his conviction, he made a last-ditch effort at freedom by filing an appeal, because why not? He had nothing left to lose except his sanity at this point. The appeal, however, was summarily rejected. Wachira's next destination was the Industrial Area Prison, a place known for its unique brand of rehabilitation, which, in this case, involved severe mental and psychological torture. His travel itinerary later continued with a transfer to Kamiti Maximum Prison, followed by another transfer to Kodiaga Maximum Security Prison in Kisumu. Kodiaga had a reputation for high prisoner mortality, which, for Wachira, was not at all reassuring. It was the kind of place where your survival was considered a stroke of luck rather than a right. In these establishments, Wachira was consistently treated to hard labor, a regimen that did unwelcome wonders for his mental and psychological suffering. But Wachira, ever the resilient one, kept his wits about him, even as his situation grew bleaker by the day. To make matters worse, newspaper reports about his arrest and conviction spread like wildfire. These were not the sort of headlines one would clip out and send to relatives. If anything, they were the kind you'd hope would be buried in the back pages, possibly never to be seen. But even in a world without the internet, bad news still traveled fast. At this point, nobody remembered Wachira's stellar performance at work. At his workplace, his reputation was as ruined as his employer's faith in him. When Wachira was finally released in August 1989, he discovered that the world outside had not grown any kinder. His employment? Gone. His reputation? In tatters. His future prospects? About as bright as those dingy Nyayo house cells. In an era when the government had the power to ruin lives with a single accusation, Wachira found himself unemployable, his life reduced to a series of unfortunate events that no amount of therapy could easily undo. Yet, he wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. Luckily, 2002 brought a wave of change, a new government, a new vision, and a renewed hope for the justice system. It was a historical moment in Kenya, a time when the past could finally be confronted, and the wrongs of the Nyayo regime righted. Wachira, ever the optimist, saw this as his chance. He boldly dragged the government to court, demanding compensation for torment he had endured. His case was simple. He had been tortured, his rights violated, and he wanted compensation. After all, if you've been interrogated naked and beaten up for days on end, you deserve more than just an apology. He wasn't asking for much, just 8,402,600 Kenya shillings, a sum that probably seemed like pocket change compared to his harrowing experience at the Nyayo House torture chambers. The government's response to Wachira's lawsuit was a masterclass in bureaucratic evasion. First, they argued that Wachira hadn't disclosed the identity of the policeman who arrested him. Of course, it was perfectly reasonable to expect someone who had been tortured to take careful notes of his tormentors' names and ranks right. The state also pointed out that Wachira hadn't provided evidence of being tortured at Nyayo House, or even the name of the chief magistrate who convicted him. The government also suggested that Wachira's claims should be heard by the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, TJRC, and not by the court. To be clear, the TJRC was body whose main achievement was listening to people's grievances and then encouraging heartfelt apologies and reconciliation, which, as you might imagine, didn't quite cut it for someone who had lost years of his life to unlawful imprisonment and torture. Moreover, the government argued that Wachira's claim was stale, having been brought a whopping 17 years after the events complained of. According to the state, although the Constitution protected human rights, the law also limited the time in which one could sue for human rights violations. The idea that time heals all wounds seemed to be taken literally by the state. the government failed to grasp that some wounds fester, especially when they involve being beaten with broken furniture and starved in a dungeon. To add insult to injury, the state also contended that Wachira had accepted his criminal trial before the magistrate's court as valid because he had even appealed against the conviction. Now, I must admit, the logic here was so twisted it could have passed for a piece of modern art. Having listened to this protracted exchange of arguments, the High Court was ready to render judgment. For starters, the judge declared that claims of human rights violations could not go stale, as the government seemed to suggest. In other words, no matter how long it had been, if your rights are violated, you deserve justice. According to the judge, Wachira had proved his unlawful arrest, confinement, and arbitrary detention. The fact that the government couldn't even muster a defense against his claims of torture was appalling. It was like watching someone trying to argue that gravity didn't exist while repeatedly falling down the stairs. What's more, even though Wachira's delay in filing suit had been a point of contention, he supplied a reasonable explanation for it. He said that up until 1989, he had been political prisoner, and by the time he was released, the government that authored his suffering was still in power. It wasn't until the 2002 elections brought about significant change in leadership that he felt safe enough to pursue his case. The court acknowledged this fact and even pointed out that, indeed, many similar cases had been brought after the change of government. The judge decided that Wachira deserved compensation, but not the full amount he had sought. Instead of the 8,402,600 Kenya shillings he had claimed, the court only awarded him 2.5 million shillings, a sum that was both a recognition of his suffering and a reminder that justice, while served, is often a bit cold. The court also refused to award exemplary or aggravated damages, citing the acknowledged change in the government and its attempts at dealing with human rights violations. In the end, it was a bittersweet victory for Wachira, who had fought so hard for justice, only to receive a fraction of what he deserved. Wachira's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. It's also a reminder of the absurdity of life under a political regime that saw human rights as optional and justice as an inconvenience. The courtroom drama, the government's feeble attempts at evasion, and the eventual verdict all paint a picture of a country struggling to reconcile with its past while trying to build a better future. In the end, Wachira got his compensation. But it was a hollow victory. No amount of money could erase the years of torture, the loss of his reputation, or the mental and physical scars that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yet his story serves as a warning and a lesson that no government, no matter how powerful, is above the law, and that justice, while slow and imperfect, can still be achieved. As for the Nyayo House torture chambers, they remain a dark chapter in Kenya's history, a reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when power goes unchecked. Wachira's tale may be one of many, but it's a story that needs to be told, if only to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. This has been Laws and Outlaws. If you enjoyed this real-life court drama, please subscribe and join us on our next courtroom adventure. See you there.